Welcome to the Redhead Reveal podcast. I am Jenn Pinkerton, your Redhead host, a psychotherapist, high-performance coach, writer, and speaker. As a connection expert, I help people reveal their connectedness within relationships, transforming from the root causes of beliefs and behaviors that hold them back from thriving in life. Let's talk about how you're thriving. Today, if you've ever had a question about grief, I have the expert here with me today. And I have to tell you, I had not really, even as a psychotherapist, I had not done the amount of research and reading as I did and learning about everything that you have done, Claire. And it was eye-opening to me. And I love this specialization. I love what you have done and basically what you've turned your life experience to. And so welcome today. Claire, I had to have you on here, and I want to be sure I get all of this information right here with your best books here. Claire Bidwell Smith. We have The Rules of Inheritance, Anxiety, Missing Stage of Grief, Conscious Grieving, After This, and Anxious Grief. I mean, I'm not even
It's a lot of books.
without a doubt. I mean, you are such an expert in this field, and I feel really, really privileged to have you here on the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, oftentimes I think that people, when they think about grief, their immediate thought is heaviness and sadness. And when I was looking into your work, I noticed one of the things you really talk about is that it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start there. Let's start with what you think about grief in that way and your scope and the lens in which you see it through.
Yeah, thank you for starting there. I think it's an important piece of grief that we often overlook, and we do think about it as heavy and sad. But, I really believe that we grieve throughout our lifetimes. It's something that starts early on in our life. Maybe we're grieving pets we lose, or we're moving schools or childhood homes, or parents getting divorced, or we are losing people even early on in life. We're always kind of going through various experiences of grief. And I think that what I have really come to understand about grief is that it asks a lot of us. It asks us to really kind of look at what we value, what's meaningful to us, who we want to be in the world. It's an incredibly difficult experience to go through, to lose someone or something we love. But in that process, I think we kind of end up being forced to emerge into a new version of ourselves that's often more compassionate, has more wisdom, has more of an understanding of what we want to do with our time here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love the way you put that. You know, your own experience with grief, I think, is what propelled you to have this as your specialization. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was 14 when both of my parents got cancer at the same time. I'm an only child, and my mom died when I was just starting college, when I was 18. And she and I had been incredibly close, just really friends, and she was a wonderful mother. And then my father died 7 years later when I was 25. So I entered into young adulthood with a lot of grief and a lot of really big existential questions about life, and really in a very different place than a lot of my peers who were kind of, just doing the normal 20-something things, trying on new relationships and apartments and careers. And I was grappling with, like, what are we doing here? What is the human experience? And what does it mean to be in this world? And why do some people have some lives and some have others? And I also felt very alone in my experience. It was grief is thankfully being talked about more than ever these days. But 20, 25 years ago, it was something that a lot of people really were afraid to kind of peel up the lid of and really talk about and hold space for. And so I felt very alone in it. I ended up going back and getting my master's in clinical psychology. I'd always been a writer, but decided I kind of wanted to do something more with my time and my work. And then I worked in hospice for a number of years, and I've now been in private practice for about 15 years.
It's so amazing that you were able to experience that and really create this platform to help others heal in the way that you've healed. And I think that's
Thank
really
you.
wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I really was seeing a lot, even when I was in grad school to become a therapist, that this just wasn't an area that a lot of people felt comfortable in. They were scared of it. They didn't know how to talk about it. They hadn't had experience with it. And I thought, well, if I've had all this experience and I'm comfortable talking about it, then maybe it would be helpful if I put myself out there and started doing this work. And, I went into it thinking I knew a lot about grief, but really I just knew my grief. And I've learned so much from every single person I've sat with about the kinds of things that we can lose, the way that grief can show up and manifest in our lives, the ways that we can use it to transform ourselves and heal. And I continue to learn every day more and more about it. It really is, I think one of the most universal human experiences we'll go through is to grieve, to lose, to go through that kind of change and identity shift. And so I think holding space for it on a regular basis, I do see a lot of beauty. It's a lot about love and relationships and the lives we live.
And I couldn't agree more, because I think losing and experiencing loss is part of that human condition in general. We are all going to have loss. There's no way to continue to have that. That's one of the certainties in life, and a lot of people, though, do shun from that and shy away from that. I personally, as a psychotherapist, I don't work with grief, I work with relationships and couples, and that's not my space. And I love hearing about other people that are able to do that, because it is such a gift to be able to have that natural sense of soothingness and calmness. And even your voice in itself is that way. And I think that really is a gift to have, to be able to have access to somebody that can understand you during that time. And it is a time of transformation. It's not the gloom and doom. It's a time of rebirth. It's a time of let me heal. It's a time for let me look at life in a very different lens than I am right now. And trying to experience something, maybe basically propelling to something very different on the other side.
Yeah, I think it's hard to go through a big loss and not experience a lot of identity shifts. Sometimes a loss can really impact our day-to-day lives in terms of where we live, our finances, our even, can we continue working? Do we want to make big changes? Our social lives can change. Our parenting lives can change. There's a lot that can happen that I think most people don't really quite see from the outset or from the outside. And so really kind of thinking about it in terms of change, loss is about change. And I think that's something every psychotherapist sits with. And by the way, I'm afraid of working with couples. So, we all have our baskets that we work in and are skilled in.
That's right, exactly. So this deeply personal experience of loss that you had, I imagine that gives you such a commonality with people that you work with. And I think that's very different in that type of work too, because in therapy, we don't often connect or relate, with our therapists in that way, because there's just not much of a personal idea of what they've been through. But I think grief, it's so different in that way, because you have that ability to relate on such a different level that maybe most therapists never get to or not able to do.
Yeah, there is a different personal element to this work for sure. I don't talk in depth at all about my losses, or people can read my books. People will come to me because they've already read. But I think that a lot of people feel really more comfortable seeing someone that they know has been through this. I remember when I first started working in hospice, I was only like 29 years old. I was so young, and I would lead these grief groups in a hospital in Chicago. And I would walk into the room, and these people who were all older than me would look at me like, oh, what does this young kid know about what I'm going through? And I would even just sometimes say that one of my parents had died, usually my dad, because he had died in hospice. And so I would say, I have experience taking care of my dad in hospice. And I would see all of their countenance really shift, oh, okay, she gets it. She understands what I've just come through. And so I think that there is something really beautiful in that kind of human to human relational aspect of grief.
Well, you're connecting at a very visceral level, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Your work involves this unique mix of therapy and education and writing. What do you think about how all those mediums complement each other in a way that you have a very different approach to grief than maybe other people do?
I love it. I've been a writer since I was a little kid, and I feel like writing and therapy go really well together because it's about, the stories we carry, the narratives we carry about our experiences in life, whether it's about loss or relationships. We all carry a kind of story about what that means and who we are. And I feel like in therapy, our work is to help people examine those stories and sometimes change them and, get rid of pieces or add in new pieces or look at a new way to reframe the telling of that story, the holding of it. So there's a real beauty in both modalities, I think.
These books, I wanted to particularly mention the difference. I think, was this one your first one? Do I have this in the right order?
Mm-hmm.
So to go from this book to then continue writing about it, where did you see that I'm not done yet? I'm not done. There's more to talk about. There's more work to do with grief. What did that look like for you?
Well, I think, I am constantly working with people in grief, whether it's retreats or support groups or one on one. And I just continue to learn more and more about it. And I continue to kind of examine the different ways that we can heal, whether it's how we can become anxious after a loss or how we work on feelings of guilt and regret after we lose someone we love. And each time I kind of unlock another understanding of it, it's something I just want to share. I think it's a personality trait, perhaps. I've had a couple of astrologers tell me that I have something in the house of death and dying and something in the house of communication, which means that all my life I'm going to write and communicate about death and dying. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess that is happening.
Well, it doesn't seem like they're wrong. So,
yes. But each book is kind of a new understanding of something I really want to impart about grief. When my mom died when I was 18, there was very little out there, very little for me to kind of turn to and understand what I was going through. And while there are now so many more grief books out there, I still think that it's so valuable for us to really learn from each other and have some kind of framework and ways to understand this experience.
what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about grief and about that healing process?
I think grief is much bigger than most people anticipate. I think it's a much bigger, more unwieldy emotional experience that people are really unprepared for. I think we can try to imagine it. We see depictions of it on television or in the movies. Maybe we've seen friends go through loss, but then when it happens to us, there's this way of no longer knowing who you are in some ways. You can wake up in the morning and you're not sure how you're going to get out of bed, or you're walking across the room and suddenly you're on the floor in a heap of tears, and so much of it is just a lot bigger than we anticipate. I think grief is very lonely, which is something that we don't realize is coming. It can feel very isolating to find people to talk to or people who will be able to just hold space for it. Everyone around us when we're grieving really wants to fix it. They want us to feel better. I had a client tell me the other day that every time her mom calls, she's just lost her husband, and every time her mom calls, her mom says, "You good?" That's what the first thing she says on the phone, like not even allowing space for any other option besides "You good?" Everything's good. And I think that a lot of us who are grieving meet that experience in the outside world where people just want us to be better and they want us to be back on our feet and they want us to be okay. And it's usually out of a good place. But when the outside world is not holding space for our grief, it makes us kind of shrink back and start to isolate, start to not trust our process. We start to wonder, should I be better? It's been a couple of months. Should I be, jumping back into life again, even when I don't feel ready to? So there's a lot that I think is really hidden, that when we go through a big loss ourselves, we're pretty surprised by the enormity of the experience.
And I think it is so enormous. I think that it's, just as though there are stages we go through and it's so fluid and it's so different from every person. And each person has their own unique experience with it. And I don't think two people ever grieve the same. Do you agree with that?
I do. And I know that can be frustrating for some people to hear, because yes, grief is a universal experience that we will all go through, but each loss is different. Each experience of grief is different. And, it all depends on these factors like the relationship with the person that we had that we lost. Sometimes we have a very deep, very close, very day-to-day relationship. Sometimes it's a more excuse me, sometimes it's a more tenuous relationship where maybe we weren't seeing them that often or they didn't play as big of a role in our life. Sometimes it's a very complicated relationship that was hurtful, and that lends itself to a complicated grief. Our grief depends on our place in life. If you're already in a precarious place, maybe you're going through a divorce or you've just kind of lost a job and then you get hit with a big loss on top of that, it's going to be a different grief experience than if you are in a really stable moment in time where you feel like you have a lot of support and resources to help yourself through this. So each experience is going to be different. The losses can build on each other too. I know a lot of people who go through multiple losses in a short period of time. There's so many different factors.
What do you think about people who are grieving and they, what looks like to the outside world, bounce back quickly? They immediately are able to, they feel as though they processed it. They're out there trying to live their life and they get that pushback. They get that negative connotation from people that maybe they're not allowed to be experiencing joy again. Maybe they're not supposed to be happy again. Or someone who maybe had a loss in a romantic relationship. And so then they get involved in a new romantic relationship and what others might think is too soon.
I mean, this just comes down to that constant judgment people from the outside have. Either you're grieving too long or you're grieving too little. People really like to try to put us in a box. But again, each grief is different. Our personalities are so different. You look at people who are extroverted, who maybe are really good at showing up and doing this intense, heavy work. They might move through a grief much faster than other people. And that might be surprising to people on the outside. Or they might jump into another relationship. Who are we to say if that's the best thing for them? In some cases, there are great examples of people who got into new relationships very quickly. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not honoring the person that they lost and loved. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not doing the work. It means that we're humans and that we love to be in relationship and we love other humans and that we're constantly, in this lifetime of life and love and work and struggle. And it's really hard to put a box around someone's grief and say that it should look a particular way.
I agree. And I like what you just said. And I want to recap that about that we are human and we like to be in relationships because people do. People feed off that. It's we are, born to love and be loved. That's just part of how our nervous systems are created and how we are wired mentally. And I think that I've just seen so much of that sort of pushback, what we're talking about, so much of that judgment of you're just not supposed to be feeling yet. You're not supposed to be happy yet. And I think that's just such a disservice, to have judgment for someone when they're going to heal in your unique way that's based on their own attachment style too sometimes. The way that they're able to bounce back might have a lot to do with how they are relationally as a person.
I agree. And sometimes some of the best work we can do in terms of relationship work is when we're in a relationship. It's hard to do some of that work if we're not in a relationship. And so I agree. And I think there's a lot of beauty to be found in the ways that we connect with each other and want to be loved and love others. I think that outside judgment, I think one of the things that's really helpful with that, if you're someone who is grieving and receiving that outside judgment, is to find a community of other people who are grieving, who can understand. I run these weekly support groups, and the things that people are able to come in and say to each other that they just can't say in the outside. I have a group for women who've lost a spouse or a partner, and I have a group for moms who've lost children. And the things that they're able to say in those circles are so different than what they're hearing on the outside. But when they can say those and when they can feel supported and understood, then they don't care as much about the outside judgment.
Well, and I think they feel it's normalizing it, a sense of community and normalizing that you're not alone in this. And there's other people that are experiencing something either easier or in a more difficult way than you are. It's that normalization and the feeling of that you're not alone.
Absolutely.
You mentioned in your book about hitting rock bottom, about getting to this place. And that was when you had such a pivotal moment. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I did what most people do. I tried to run from my grief. I tried to avoid it. I tried to cover it up. I tried to pretend like I was okay. And largely this was due to all the outside messages of people telling me I should be fine. a lot of people around me when my parents died were like, well, you're a young adult now, you'll be fine, you're on your feet. And I wasn't, and I kept trying to be. And so because I was really bottling up my grief and not processing it, not sitting with it, not connecting, finding community with it, I just kept stuffing it down, and it kept spilling out in anxiety. It kept spilling out in like, unhealthy coping methods, drinking too much or trying to travel, or, toxic relationships. And I really did kind of hit a rock bottom at which I really realized that the answer was sitting with my grief and letting myself really feel it and understand it. And that looked like a lot of things: therapy, yoga, meditation, really kind of holding space for all the pain I was carrying and starting to understand how I was going to move forward in life, carrying a lot of it still. I'm 46 years old now, and I have 3 kids who've never met my parents. And I've experienced so much of my life without them. Yet that grief is still there. It's not acute anymore. It's not something where it's causing my knees to buckle when I cross a room, but it's on my mind a lot, and it affects my decisions and my day-to-day life, but sometimes in really powerful, meaningful ways, in the ways that make me want to create a meaningful life, in the ways that make me really want to be present with my family, in the ways that make me want to bring my parents' legacy forward, and honor them. So there's a lot of, kind of beautiful ways that those losses show up today. But it took really learning that rock bottom really meant me starting to learn how to carry the losses forward with me.
But what I hear you saying is that it's okay to carry that. It's okay to still have a piece of that with you. It's not as
Yeah.
though when we process this and we mourn and we process the loss, that suddenly it's just gone from us, that we leave
Yeah.
it behind. And I think that's probably something that a lot of people don't realize, is that
Mm-hmm.
you can still carry the feeling, the pain, the memories, the loss, all of those things combined together in this recipe that allows us to continue to move forward, but it's still present.
That's really what it's about. It's really learning to move forward while carrying those. Like I'll go to open house tonight at my son's school, and there will inevitably be, other parents there, but I bet there will be some grandmothers or grandfathers there too. And I'll have a little pang of like, gosh, what would it be like if my parents were here, if they could see this? And what I've learned is to kind of carry that moment, to hold it, to recognize it and honor it, and to keep being here and to keep like creating a meaningful life, even while I'm carrying some of those pain points.
And you're talking about feeling to heal, basically, which is something I really champion. And we talk about a lot on this podcast, is I think of so much of what holds people back in life from their ability to thrive in a relationship
Mm-hmm.
or thrive in life in any successful manner, is because they haven't learned how to feel to heal, how to process, how to hold space for themselves, how to be able to acknowledge something they're feeling in their body, taking that inventory internally and acknowledging what that feeling is like and processing it and talking about it and having a healthy inner voice about it. And
Mm-hmm.
what I hear you saying is basically grief has a very direct parallel to that in the way you move through that.
Yeah, it really does. We have to show up to it. I mean, that's what conscious grieving is all about. It's about leaning into grief. It's about really leaning into those feelings, learning how to hold them, learning how to just really feel safe and still allow for the enormity of grief to come up. Again, like a lot of people, we really tend to run from it and avoid it. But I think the answer is really truly leaning into it. One of the things that I talk about with conscious grief is how, loss is something that happens to us. It's not something we invited. I didn't ask for my parents to leave so soon. It was never something I would have designed for myself. Yet, how I grieve is up to me. So loss is something that happens to us, but how we grieve is up to us. So we can choose to embrace it. We can lean into it. We can learn from it. We can support ourselves through it. We can grow from it.
If someone is feeling an overwhelming sense of grief, maybe someone listening right now who is going through that process and who feels almost that where they're choked by it, almost
Mm-hmm.
where they're flooded by it, and they're not able to get past that. They can't see past that overwhelming sense of the emotional loss. What would you
Mm-hmm.
say to them?
Well, I don't think anyone should grieve alone. So finding support for sure. And support sometimes is just reading a book or listening to a podcast, or it maybe talking to a counselor or a therapist or joining a group. But really like feeling you need to kind of find a place where you can feel safe and supported to let that out, because I can't tell you how many people will say to me, I'm afraid if I start crying, I'll never stop. They get that big swell of emotion and they're so afraid of it that they try to tamp it down because they're afraid if it spills out, they're just going to collapse or go crazy or never recover. And so, really finding the right support so that you can start to let it out. We have to feel it.
In your book, Conscious Grieving, you talk about grieving consciously and you give this framework. And I wanted to mention these stages because I thought it was really great. This entering, engaging, surrendering, and transforming. Can you just kind of explain a little bit about what those are and break down those stages for us?
Yeah, the engaging in grief is kind of, the part where the loss has happened and now we're just in it, we're just in the grief. And so how do we support ourselves? What are some very basic things we need to understand about grief and ways we can get grounded within it? And then engaging in it is really, entering into it. And then engaging in it is really like, how do we start to use actual tools to work with it? Do we need to work on our anxiety that comes up after a loss? Do we need to, work through a complicated relationship that we had with the person who died? Or do we need to address feelings of guilt or regret? How are our family dynamics being affected? What's our like day-to-day life like? And then the surrendering is the piece where we really kind of soften to it. There's so many ways that in the beginning of a big loss, we really try to fight it and get our hands around it, control it.
Yes.
People will tell me that they buy like 20 grief books and they read all the things and they're like, I want homework. And then there's this point at which they kind of come around to an acceptance that this is going to be something that they'll carry for a long time. And how can they just kind of surrender and soften to it? And from there, that process really leads to the transformative piece. Transformation is not something anyone in the beginning of a big loss really wants to hear about. You lose a child, you lose your best friend, you lose a parent. You don't want to hear about how you're going to transform through that. You just want them to back in the room. You want them back in your arms. But it is a piece that I think we need to acknowledge because there is hope in loss. It doesn't always have to be this horrific, heavy, terrible thing where we're just doomed for the rest of our lives to this heavy grief. I think we really, when we do lean into it, we begin to learn and grow from it. Trust me, I would take my parents back for all the wisdom and compassion that I've gained. Yet I'm really grateful for the person that I've become through this and for everything I've learned about myself and the world in my grief process.
And I hear a lot of self-love too in what you're talking about. And I think that having compassion for yourself is so important in any part of life. And I think it really directly relates to the compassion you've got to feel for yourself going through this grief process.
Yeah. Self-compassion is a huge part of this. We are so hard on ourselves in grief. We really are. Our lives are changing so drastically sometimes in our emotional realm, and we beat ourselves up for it. We think we should be doing better. We should be able to jump out of bed, a little faster. And, we've got to give ourselves grace and compassion and self-love.
How often do you think that people experiencing complex grief at the same time? They've lost two parents at once. They've maybe lost children at some time. What do you think that complex grief looks like as far as being able to understand how different that is or is not? How does that compare, if we even can compare, when we're talking about grief in that way?
Some grief is simple is not the right word, but there's some grief that's very pure. My father, when he died, we had said all our goodbyes. We had a pretty easy relationship. There was not a lot of complicated feelings around his death. My mother, and he was 83. He had lived a really wonderful long life. He died the way he wanted to. My mother died at 58. She did not want to die. She did not face the end of her life. We didn't say goodbye. I wasn't there when she died. There was a lot of turmoil around it, right? And all of that turmoil led to all of these kind of layers I had to move through. I had to work through guilt and regret. I had to, deal with my anxiety around, not having a parent and understanding that parents can die soon. There was a lot of layers of complicated grief I had to sift through. Whereas my father's, I could kind of move very quickly into a place of just loving him and missing him and this kind of pure grief. It was easier to access. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of the difference between complicated grief and a kind of more typical grief is that there's just more layers that we need to work through, and they take time. Those are layers that really take different ways to address them. Guilt and regret are a huge part of many people's grief processes, and those are aspects that I think feel really insurmountable in the beginning, but in time, especially, with a skilled therapist or counselor, we can really kind of unlock those pieces and hold them in different ways.
And I want to ask you about the type of grief when someone maybe has learned, my partner's passed away, and then I learned what I didn't know. I learned
Mm-hmm.
there was infidelity. I learned that there might have been
Mm-hmm.
a lot more going on that I wasn't privy to. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you process the difference between the anger with the loss and the love? You
Yeah.
know, how does
Well,
that
again, it's like you have to work through a whole bunch of layers in that kind of case in order to get to a place of just kind of that more pure grief. Anger is a really valid component of grief. There's a lot of things to be angry at. There's a lot of unresolved aspects of relationships, or we do find out things about people that we didn't know. I do firmly believe that the relationships we have with the people we lost are ongoing. And there are ways that we can continue those relationships in beautiful ways, whether it's me bringing my mother into my life and the lives of my children today, or whether it's something more complicated and there's stuff to resolve still.
right?
We have an internal relationship with the people that we've loved and lost. We can have conversations with them still. We can be angry with them. We can forgive them. We can, talk to them. There are so many ways that we can continue to kind of work through those big, heavy pieces, even when in the beginning it feels like, oh my God, they're gone. And I'm sitting here with this mess. How am I ever going to sort through all this because they're gone? In time, I think we can really begin to understand those more internal relationships that do lend themselves to a lot of different ways we can work through those pieces.
hmm Something else that has to have so many layers is when we're looking at the loss of a child and yet there's still other children.
Mm-hmm.
How can you continue to function, to show up, to be there in the way that you want to be for your family and to experience that love and joy when you're also experiencing so much loss?
Yeah, this is one of the most difficult losses out there. It really is. And I think you have to have so much grace and compassion for yourself as you kind of go on that journey. There's a lot of ways in the beginning of child loss where you're really simply surviving. You're doing the basic you can for yourself, for your family, for your other kids. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of healing and a lot of support in order to get to a place where you can really kind of thrive again and feel comfortable, being in your life and your family, even though you're always missing that other child. So many beautiful ways I've heard about the ways in which families bring their missing child forward into the lives of, their other kids and the ways that they live now. But it's a deeply, deeply painful loss that I think if you're not really getting support around it, people do really shut down. They get frozen in their grief. But there's so many ways that I think we can find the right support in order to just help us be able to be present and live our lives again.
And that freezing that you're talking about, I think, is the culprit for what happens when maybe two people, parents, end up divorcing. They cannot
Mm-hmm.
manage that grief process together. And so
Mm-hmm.
they end up not being together. And then there's an additional type of loss
Yeah.
as well from that family unit of that relationship or that marriage. And I think it does directly correlate to that feeling of being frozen, the feeling of that our body is overwhelmed beyond our ability to cope. And,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't connect. They lose what you keep referencing as presence. And I think that's a perfect way to describe it. They can't be present. They're frozen. They're not able to connect in that loss. And so then we have that additional loss.
Oh, so many secondary losses for sure. And then the surviving children will often feel the loss of their parents in many ways.
Mhm.
That's not the mom I used to have. That's not who she used to be.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of heartbreak around that. But again, I have seen so much beautiful healing happen, especially within community, for people who've lost a child, to be with other people who really understand that and to be able to lean on them and be able to talk about things that they can't anywhere else it's vital.
Being that you have so many great books that I have really loved diving into, if someone was going to read one right now in active grief, which one do you think would be the best for them?
I think conscious grieving is the best one to start with because it's really the overall of like, how can we lean into this? What is grief?
Mhm.
How do we get to know it? How can we feel safe in it? And from there, the other books kind of get more specific about anxiety or about the afterlife.
Mhm.
But I think conscious grieving, I really wrote it intending it to be the book that anybody could pick up at any point in their grief, especially in the beginning, and just get a base understanding and some reassurance about what they're going through.
And lastly on that, what would you tell someone if it was only one thing you could say to somebody that felt like they're struggling, they're here listening to this today, maybe they haven't gotten help yet, or maybe they're in getting help, but they don't feel like they're coming out on the other side yet.
Yeah.
What would you like to tell that person from the place you sit of so much knowledge and extensive history with this?
Just that you're not alone. There's so many of us out here going through it, and that there is so much support available. And no matter how stuck you feel or how much you miss your person, there are ways to kind of unlock those pieces and move through some of the places where you feel stuck and find new ways to connect with your person and hold them with you.
So anybody hearing that, I hope you can get that message. And I'm really excited to add your books to our library here to really help so many people that struggle with the grief process too. I want to ask you about our guest question. We always have a question that a prior guest has left for the new one. And I want to give that to you. And then in turn, I want you to be able to think about something you would like to leave for a future guest. So the question that I'm going to serve to you here is, someone asked, how often are you allowing for pleasure in your life, and what is it that brings you pleasure?
I allow for so much pleasure because I think the work that I do constantly reminds me that our time here is so precious, and that our relationships and all of the moments of connection that we have are so fleeting and so precious. So I find pleasure in like the littlest things, my son in his sleep when he flings an arm over me if he's in bed with me, and or just, a moment where just watching the sun come through leaves on a tree. It's caused this work, and my experiences in grief have caused me to open up to pleasure in like the smallest ways, and just bring so much presence to my life. And I'm really grateful to that part of the grief process.
Oh, and I hear that gratitude from you. That's all right. What would you like to leave for someone else?
My question for someone else would be, what can we learn from grief?
Okay. Well, I will be excited to share that with the next guest, and you can tune in to see what they left with you for that.
I can't wait. Thank you so much for having me and for holding this space for people who are grieving.
I've absolutely loved it, Claire. It's really been great getting to know you.
You too. Thank you
so much. All right.